have the right to understand your loan, and we are proud to offer you the best programs and the best interest rates in the industry. First Choice Title offers you the most on any vehicle, ATV, motorcycle, boat, or trailer. And best of all, there's no credit check. So come on down. Let's help you out of your current high interest title pond or tight spot.
First Choice Title.
Every dream begins with hope, and every achievement starts with a spark. Black history is filled with dreamers who dared to see beyond the impossible. They've lifted communities, reshaped industries, and inspire us to believe that change is within reach. This Black History Month, we honor those who had the courage to dream and the strength to do, reminding us all that greatness is born from action. Let their stories ignite the dreams in all of us.
You're watching WSST My 55 in South Georgia, because local matters.
The Jwwilliams funeral directors have been proudly serving the people of this community since 1918. Service is our motto. The poor, the rich, the middle class and all are given the best of care and attention at all times. You have the privilege to select what you want. In your time of need, contact the capable, the competent, and the dependable staff of the Jwwilliams Funeral Home who is genuinely concerned with your care. At Jwwilliams Funeral Home, you are aptly served by the proprietor president, Deacon Arthur L. Parker, who continues the traditions and values set forth by the past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams. Your announcements for the Jwwilliams Funeral Home Sunday morning program are Deacon Arthur L. Parker, Reverend Isaac H. Owens, Mrs. Calandra Wilkerson Parker, Minister Frankie Harmon, Ms. Sandra Johnson, and Deacon Earl Clark, Jr.
Thank you, and good morning, friends. We come to you this morning to bring announcements, dedications, and songs. We certainly hope that your day may be brighter after listening to our program. The family of Mr. Jwwilliams Howard of Byronville, Georgia. The family of Mr. Walter Lee Mobley Sr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Annie Bell Hawkins of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Joe Panzer Hooks of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Mitchell James Johnson of Lithonia, Georgia. The family of Mr. Robert Thomas Jr. of Cordele, Georgia. Would like to thank their many friends for the food, the flowers, the condolences, and all other expressions of sympathy and kindness shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. Mr. Jwwilliams Howard, age 22, of 664 Mims Road, Byronville, Georgia, died Sunday, January 26, of injury sustained in an automobile accident. The funeral service for Mr. Jwwilliams Howard, age 22, was held Tuesday, February 4th, in the chapel of the Jwwilliams Funeral Home in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Jerry Sanders, pastor of the Bethlehem Baptist Church of Doolin, Georgia, officiated. The burial followed at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted parents, Mr. Jawan Hardrick of Vienna, Vienna, Georgia, and Miss Krista A. Howard of Pennsylvania. A beloved sister, Miss Jade N. Power of Pennsylvania. His caring brothers, Mr. Jaquel L. Howard and Mr. Jamarcus L. Power Jr. of Hawkinsville, Georgia, Mr. Marquarius Minor of Warner Robins, Georgia, and Mr. Jadarius Hardrick of Vienna, Georgia. His beloved grandparents, Mr. Johnny and Mrs. Jeanette Kendrick of Byronville, Georgia, Miss Betty Hardrick and Mr. Bennett Sr. of Vienna, Georgia. His beloved aunts and uncles, Mrs. Trinica Hall and her husband, Mr. Garrett Hall, Mr. Travis Howard, Mr. Brian Adam, Miss Condra Hardrick, Miss Lachey Bennett, Miss Angela Bennett, Mr. Bendris Bennett Jr., and Mr. Richard Bennett, all of Columbus, Georgia. A host of beloved cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Jashawn Jaquez Howard, age 22, of 664 Mims Road, Byronville, Georgia. Mr. Walter Lee Mobley Sr., age 84, of 446 Fish Hatchery Road, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, February 5th, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Walter Lee Mobley Sr., age 84, was held Saturday, February 8th, in the sanctuary of the Shady Grove Baptist Church in Cordele, Georgia. The pastor, Reverend Kelvin E. Drake, officiated. The burial followed at the Westview Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Mr. Walter Lee Mobley Jr. and his wife, Mrs. Margaret Mobley of Cordele, Georgia, Mrs. Patricia Roll Holton and her husband, Mr. Alvin Holton of Lakeland, Florida, Mrs. Melissa Mobley McLeod and her husband, Mr. Larry McLeod of Cordele, Georgia, Mrs. Janika Yancey and her husband, Mr. Quincy Yancey of Chesapeake, Virginia, and Mr. Lindsey Johnson and his wife, Mrs. Connie Johnson of Atlanta, Georgia. 18 beloved grandchildren, a host of great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, including a special grandson, Mr. Jotarius Mobley. His beloved sisters, Ms. Dora Avery of Lake City, Florida, Mrs. Lucinda Colterton of Jacksonville, Florida, and Ms. Lula Mae Mobley of Atlanta, Georgia. A host of devoted nieces and nephews, to include a devoted niece, Mrs. Priscilla Rockman of Cordele, Georgia. A host of cousins and friends, to include his special friends, Miss Maddie Sue Harris, Mr. Terry White, Mr. Hinton Dean, Mr. Jim and Miss Patsy Jackson, Miss Rosalind Porter, and Mr. George Lester, survived Mr. Walter Lee Mobley Sr., age 84, of 446 Fish Hatchery Road, Cordele, Georgia. Mrs. Annie Bell Hawkins, age 71, of 1111 McClendon Court, Cordele, Georgia, died Tuesday, January 28th, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The memorial service for Mrs. Annie Bell Hawkins, age 71, was held Saturday, February 8th in the sanctuary of the Hilltop Church of Christ in Cordele, Georgia. The pastor, Brother James L. Hughes, officiated. Survivors include her loving and devoted children, Mr. Kelvin Bell of Tennessee, Mrs. Elizabeth Stanford and her spouse, Mr. Cosmo Brown of Savannah, Georgia, and Mrs. Ida Arnold and her spouse, Miss Melissa Arnold of Cordele, Georgia. 5 beloved grandchildren, Mr. Cortell Ford, Mr. Preston Brown, Miss Kenyana Bell, Mr. Cannon Bell, Mr. Jeremiah Early, her loving sisters, Mrs. Oris Bell of Tallahassee, Florida, Miss Mary Wayman and her spouse, Mr. David Wayman of Jacksonville, Florida, her beloved brothers, Mr. Freddie Bell of Alabama, and Mr. Sam Bell and his spouse, Mrs. Helen Bell of South Carolina, a host of beloved nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mrs. Annie Bell Hawkins, age 71, of 1111 McClendon Court, Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Joe Panzer Hook, age 84, of 611 South 11th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Sunday, February 2nd, at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Joe Panzer Hooks, age 84, was held Saturday, February 8th, in the sanctuary of the Gethsemane Baptist Church in Cordele, Georgia. The pastor, Reverend Cecil Strouder, officiated. The burial followed at the Mount Olive Church Cemetery in Warwick, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted sisters, Mrs. Sarah Prickett of Daytona, Florida, and Mrs. Elizabeth Cross of Albany, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces and nephews, to include a devoted niece, Mrs. Lizzie Hooks Burks, and her husband, Mr. James L. Burks of Cordele, Georgia. A host of devoted cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Joe Panzer Hooks, age 84, of 611 South 11th Street, Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Mitchell James Johnson, age 70, of Lithonia, Georgia, died Wednesday, January 28th, at the Crossview Care Center in Pineview, Georgia. The remains were cremated. Survivors include a beloved son, Mr. Kyrie Johnson of Brooklyn, New York, a host of other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Mitchell James Johnson, age 70, of Lithonia, Georgia. Mr. Robert Thomas Jr., age 72, of 810 South 13th Street, Cordele, Georgia. The family viewing for Mr. Robert Thomas Jr., age 72, was held Friday, February 7th, at the Jwwilliams Funeral Home in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted companion, Miss Patricia Higgins of Cordele, Georgia, his beloved children, Mrs. Tamika Peterson and her husband, Mr. Rodriguez Peterson Sr., Miss Shanteria Felton, Mr. Timothy Felton Sr., Miss Tasha Ford and her companion, Mr. Jesse L. Blanks, all of Cordele, Georgia. 13 beloved grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild, a beloved aunt, Mrs. Eva Bell Goodman of Cordele, Georgia, a host of cousins to include Miss Mary Lee Goodman of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Jesse Lee Goodman of Ashburn, Georgia, Pastor Rosa Sanford and her husband, Elder Billy Sanford, Deacon Otis Blanks and his wife, Mrs. Mary Blanks, and Mother Jessie Kate Harmon, all of Cordele, Georgia, a host of other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Robert Thomas Jr., age 72, of 810 South 13th Street, Cordele, Georgia. Again, the family of Mr. Jashawn Jaquez Howard of Byronville, Georgia, the family of Mr. Walter Lee Mobley Sr. of Cordele, Georgia, the family of Mrs. Annabelle Hawkins of Cordele, Georgia, the family of Mr. Joe Panzer Hooks of Cordele, Georgia, the family of Mr. Mitchell James Johnson of Lithonia, Georgia, the family of Mr. Robert Thomas Jr. of Cordele, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for all of the many kindnesses shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. May God bless each of you, is their prayer. The Jwwilliams Funeral Directors serving Cordele and Vienna were in charge of each of these arrangements during the past week. And now, it is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcements. Mrs. Ruby Jean Hardy Snipes, age 68, of 609 East 4th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, February 5th, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Mr. Henry Snipes, Jr. of Cordele, Georgia, his loving and devoted children, Mr. Shantoria Hardy of Seattle, Washington, Mr. Quentin Snipes of Cordele, Georgia, Miss Brittany Taylor and her husband, Mr. Rodriguez Taylor of Tifton, Georgia, Mr. Javaris Snipes and his wife, Mrs. Kimberly Snipes of Cordele, Georgia, Miss Christmas Hardrick and her husband, Mr. Willie Hardrick of Fort Valley, Georgia, Mrs. Daphne Lumpkin and her husband, Mr. Andre Lumpkin of Americus, Georgia, Mr. Jeffrey Snipes of Texas, Mr. Henry Snipes III, and Mr. Tony Snipes and his wife, Mrs. Sabrina Snipes of Americus, Georgia, 31 grandchildren, 15 great-grandchildren, her beloved sisters, Miss Laverne Anderson of Vienna, Georgia, Miss Renee Hardy and her husband, Mr. Simpson Hardy of Cordele, Georgia, her beloved brother, Mr. Raymond Davis of Savannah, Georgia, a host of devoted nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive Mrs. Ruby Jean Hardy Snipes, age 68, of 609 East 4th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Ruby Jean Hardy Snipes, age 68, will be held Saturday, February 15 at 11 a.m. at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses in Cordele, Georgia. Brother Eddie Taylor will officiate. The burial will follow at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. The public visitation will be Friday, February 14th, from 1 until 5 p.m. at the Jwwilliams Funeral Home. Mrs. Rosa Lee Fort Mays, age 68, of 612 Townsend Street, Syracuse, New York, formerly of Cordele, Georgia, died at the St. Joseph Hospital in Syracuse, New York. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Mr. Lawrence D. Mays, Jr. of Syracuse, New York. Her loving and devoted children, Miss Lenora Fort of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Darius Fort, and Mr. Edward Fort of Syracuse, New York, Mr. Scotty Fort Trotman of Reynolds, Georgia, 9 beloved grandchildren, 12 great-grandchildren, her loving sisters, Miss Gail Seymour and her husband, Mr. Jonah Seymour, and Miss Betty Fort of Syracuse, New York, and Miss Gloria Fort, a host of devoted nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive Mrs. Rosa Lee Fort Mays, age 68, of 612 Townsend Street, Syracuse, New York. The funeral service for Mrs. Rosa Lee Fort Mays, age 68, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. Mrs. Ella Ree Lockhart Green, age 80, of 1153 Oak Holland Lane, Hampton, Georgia, formerly of Americus, Georgia,